Okay, welcome back. Now let's take a look at what are the different components that make up the VMware Certificate Authority process. Like I was saying, these things used to be, when it came to vSphere 6, these were things that ran in the Platform Service Controller, separated out from the vCenter system. Now in vSphere 7, without that Platform Service Controller, these services that we are referring to all reside in the vCenter server as just one of the several services that run on the vCenter system. So this first one here is called the VMware CA, or sometimes known as the VMware Certificate Authority, or in some cases known as the VMCA. Again, what is this, right? This is the service whose job is to be a mechanism to issue certificates, so all the different vSphere services have a single source to set up trusted configurations. This is so that when, say, for instance, an ESX server gets installed, right? When you install ESXi software, the software install generates a self-signed certificate on that host. But that means nobody's going to trust that host because it's self-signed certificate. When you add that ESXi host to a vCenter server inventory, vCenter will generate a new certificate and assign it to that host automatically. But the vCenter server, of course, is going to use a self-signed certificate as well. But now there is a built-in trust between the vCenter and the ESX servers. In fact, you probably have noticed that when you add an ESXi host to a vSphere inventory, the first thing it's going to ask you is whether or not we trust that host and its identity. And you typically are presented with a thumbprint mode of what is it? The SHA-1 thumbprint will show the SHA-1 thumbprint of that host. You'll go into the host's console and verify that is the host that the thumbprint is representing. So you can do the identification yourself manually, and then that establishes the trust. vCenter issues that host a certificate. So now there's that built-in trust. There's also services that are running inside the vCenter server that need to be set with a trust relationship. So certificates are generated by a vCenter server to establish those levels of trust. And then, of course, for our vSphere client to make a connection over to vCenter server, the vCenter server has a certificate for that too. And that's also issued by the VMCA. And so your client system will need to trust that the certificate was generated by a system that the client system trusts. And it doesn't by default, right? But that's the thing, is the VMCA becomes a central root of all of the certificates being managed within the vSphere environment, right? So the main purpose of this is to issue certificates to generate a level of trust throughout the entire vSphere inventory. And the consumers of those would typically be the services that are running in vCenter and on your ESX servers, right? Services are going to request certificates to establish their own identity and to establish the identity of the vCenter or vSphere inventories. Now, the VMCA issues certificates. They're actually stored in another system service called the VMware Endpoint Certificate Store, otherwise known as VEX. And so VEX stores certificates that were issued by VMCA. It could also store certificates that may have come from other certificate authorities too. All right, it also stores private keys and other certificate information that can be stored in that key store, right? So the VEX service actually contains a whole variety of different key stores for different functions, mostly so that when there are trust relationships that are even established between vCenter server and external entities, like for instance, a key server of some kind, that set of credentials is stored in the VEX service. So another thing just to note, you have these two important services, VMCA and VEX. VEX is always there, always running, always storing credential and certificate and private keys and so on. VMCA is not required. It is there generally to generate certificates to set up the trust relationship throughout the vSphere environment, but you don't have to use the VMCA. You can actually go ahead and go and replace the certificates on your vCenter server and all the other components and on all the ESX servers yourself manually, which means that you had to go and obtain certificates from some external certificate authority. That's one approach. That's generally not something that is all that scalable because it's a manual process. That's really what the kind of the design of the VMCA is if I wanted to, have a central place to generate certificates and how I like to have the VMCA actually use those certificates, maybe that VMCA can actually be a subordinate to another certificate authority that your environment already trusts. It could be part of that chain of trust, essentially, where if your environment trusts part of that chain of trust, it should be able to trust everything that is part of that chain of trust. So having the VMCA as a subordinate to your corporate CA can make this a lot simpler. That is, of course, if your organization allows for subordinate certificate authorities, that's something else. So we'll take a look at, there are other interesting ways to work around that too. But that's an important thing to note here. Even if you decide not to use the VMCA, VEX will be used to store all vCenter server certificates, keys, and other certificate information. So on your vCenter's certificate authority, there are actually several different types of certificates. Like I was just kind of mentioning, you've got the different systems that vCenter communicates with. For instance, the VMCA is going to have its own CA certificates it's using to generate and issue new certs. But there's also what we call solution user certificates. These are the actual services that are running on the vCenter server that need to intercommunicate with each other. So they all need certificates. Now, there are over 20 odd services that need certificates. To make this simpler, if anybody needs to replace these solution user certificates, they actually are reverse proxying for those 20 odd services with just 4 solution users. So that makes this a little bit easier. If you ever needed to replace those, that's not that common though, just because this is all intercommunications, internal communications within the vCenter system. More commonly replaced would be in order for other external systems to communicate with vCenter or to communicate with the ESXi hosts. Those have what we call machine certificates. So for instance, in order for the vSphere client to connect to vCenter, vCenter has a machine certificate. In order for the host client to connect to an ESXi host, the hosts have a host client. Have an ESXi machine certificate, right? So for the host client to connect to an ESXi host, the host is going to have a machine certificate. If for the vSphere client to connect to vCenter, vCenter will also have a machine certificate. So you'll find that these are the two common types of certificate: solution users certificates and also machine certificates. So I mentioned this thing called the chain of trust, right? To trust a certificate, you must trust some part of the chain of trust, right? There are some conditions that must be true. Basically, you need to explicitly trust the certificate itself, and you must say you can, or you explicitly trust the CA that issued it. Where if you have a self-signed certificate, the issuer of the certificate and the user are the same system. Basically, the VMCA signing its own certificates is generally referred to as a self-signed certificate. That means that any client system will need to install and explicitly trust every self-signed certificate that is issued on the network. That is not a very scalable approach, having to install each and every certificate. This is like what I was just mentioning. If you needed your client systems to trust vCenter, you need your client system to trust your ESX servers, you would need to have the vCenter service machine certificate and your ESX servers machine certificates placed on the client system's own set of trusted certs. And that can be problematic in larger environments. So how do we make this simpler, right? Well, you might have an in-house or a commercial certificate authority that would eliminate the requirement of each client system having to install every self-signed certificate, as long as all the client systems trust the CA and all the certificates come from that trusted CA. So to see this as an image, here we have our client system, and we have, say, some systems it needs to work with, right? They could be things like a mail server, a database server, a web server. They could very well be a vCenter server, right? Does the client system trust those are who those systems claim to be? Well, if the client system trusts a corporate certificate authority, and the certificate authority issues certificates for those different servers, then the client system would trust that those are those systems. Right? Well, the thing is, if that certificate authority is the VMCA, the client systems don't have any native trust with that. So you could take the VMCA, add the VMCA's certificate, root certificate onto the ESX, onto the client system, and now the client system would trust any certificates that were generated by the VMCA. That makes that a little bit easier, but that now means that your client systems have to have those, that root certificate of the VMCA installed on those client systems. If you have a half dozen admins, that's not that bad of a problem. But if you have lots and lots of people need to log into vCenter, having them do that is a little bit more complicated. So another option is to add what we call an intermediate certificate authority, where in that case, the corporate CA that all your client systems already do trust could actually put a signing certificate on the intermediate certificate authority. And now the intermediate certificate authority could issue certificates for the mail server, the database server, and the web server. And since the client system trusts the CA, it should also trust certificates that were issued by the intermediate certificate authority. So the VMCA can act as that. It's basically in what we call subordinate CA mode. So then you essentially have the corporate CA's issuing certificate placed on the VMCA, and then the VMCA would then issue certificates to the vCenter server and the ISIC servers. And since your client systems trust the corporate CA that has issued the signing certificate to the intermediate certificate authority, then the client systems would trust those certificates issued by the intermediate certificate authority. In our case here would be VMCA. But of course, this all is completely dependent on whether your environment supports having a subordinate CA. So there's other options here too. That's what we're going to cover next. Understand what are the different modes that the VMCA could be running in depending on your environment. So we'll take a quick break and we'll come back and take a look at that.